A friend of mine, known as Damo, was an avid fisherman. He and his dad used to go out sea fishing whenever they could. A few years ago, he told me this story, and it creeped the hell out of me. Damo and his dad were on the second night of a deep-sea fishing trip, and they decided to get some sleep in the early evening so they could go for whatever fish they were after at around 1 a.m. Anyway, they only had a smallish boat, but the weather was extremely pleasant and the sea was calm to the point of stillness, so they figured it would be a great night's fishing for them. Around 12:30 a.m., they started to set their gear up, and as they were on the starboard side getting bait ready, they heard a loud splash on the port side. As there was almost no swell, they figured it was either a large fish or some gear had somehow fallen, and so they went over to have a look. Floating face up in the water only a few feet from the side of the boat was a young woman. They reckoned she couldn't have been more than about 30 at the most. She showed absolutely no signs of decomposition/bloating, and there was nothing tangled in her hair, all of which would normally suggest she had been in the water for some time. She was wearing a simple white skirt and a blue-colored strappy top, both of which were cleaned and apparently looked barely wet, again, all indicating she had only just gone in the water. She showed no signs of damage like having been beaten or attacked, and her eyes and mouth were shut. Damo said she looked totally peaceful and like she was simply asleep and just floating on her back in the water. They were both totally freaked out by the whole thing, but reacting more to the need to make sure she was okay. Instead of just standing there trying to work out where she came from, they tried to wake her up, shouting to her, etc., and they threw a line to her, hoping they may catch her enough to pull her back in. She showed no signs of movement, and the splashing around they were making with the rope served only to let her body drift further away from the boat. When she was a few meters away, Damo ran off to grab a fishing rod, hoping they could pull her in that way, and his dad ran to the cabin to try and call a Coast Guard for help. When Damo got back to the side, she had vanished. He frantically searched around and splashed into the water with the rod, thinking she had bobbed underwater or even drifted under the boat somehow, but the body had vanished. Eventually his dad, figuring they couldn't just leave a potential dead/unconscious body floating in the water, jumped in and swam over to where she had last been, hoping he may find her under the surface, but they couldn't find anything. They did eventually drive the boat around in a good half-kilometer circle, but they never saw the body again. The Coast Guard did come out, and obviously Damo and his dad were kind of interrogated to make sure they hadn't murdered her and dumped the body, but nothing came of it all. The freakiest thing about it all was that the boat was thoroughly checked before they had set out fishing the day before, so they could say with certainty that there had been no woman on board when they set off, either a dead body or a stowaway/homeless woman. The apparently fresh state of the body kind of removed the possibility that she had been in the water a while and that they just found the body and they were far enough out from land and nowhere near any other boats that her appearance there was just totally unexplainable, as was the way the body just disappeared. Damo and his dad hadn't been gone more than 20 seconds from the side of the boat, but in that time the body just vanished. They were both really shaken by the whole thing and were most terrified by the fact that her appearance was preceded by the heavy splash in the water, to them suggesting the body had only just entered the water from their own boat. They tell the story now as a kind of "you won't believe what happened to us once" type thing, but it shook them badly and neither has been back to the same fishing spot since. It happened last year between Christmas and New Year's Eve. I'm from the French Caribbean, so it's not unusual to scuba dive during Christmas holidays. My family and I booked a few dives. They're all really good scuba divers, better than me. They passed a few scuba diving levels that allow them to participate in way more technical dives that I'm allowed to do. I enjoy scuba diving as well, and I'm able to do almost every casual dives, but I don't feel safe diving without an instructor yet, even more if it's a dive with decompression stops required. If anyone isn't familiar with scuba diving, here's a quick explanation. You can dive safely until a certain deep before the pressure becomes dangerous. If you dive below that point, which is roughly 20 meters or 65 feet, you have to do decompression stops during your ascent. It means that you have to stop while going back to the surface a certain time to let your body adapt itself to the pressure. If you ride up too quickly, you may catch decompression sickness, which can lead, in worst case scenario, to death. We decided that I could manage a little private lesson with an instructor first, prior to more exciting dives with my family. So, the first day, my family was enjoying a dive on a technical spot that I wasn't feeling up to while I was alone with my instructor and retrieving my old scuba diving reflexes. Everything went okay. We were on a beautiful coral reef. There was many beginners on the boat, and I was by far the most experienced here. So finally my instructor decided that he could manage me with another student, which was truly a beginner, and after a small briefing with every safety rules and hand sign, which is the only way to communicate underwater, we began our descent. I quickly retrieved all my old reflexes and was enjoying myself, going back and forth to the instructor and the beginner diver. Everything was perfect beside one thing. It was a windy day and there was a heavy swell. It's less of a problem underwater than it is for a surface swimmer. The only thing was that it requires more physical effort to swim, and so my air bottle was emptying a little quicker than usual, which is normal. I signed to my instructor that I was running thin of air, and he nodded. It was at this moment that I saw a young man swimming towards me. It wasn't the instructor, nor a student. I've never seen him before, but he was in full scuba diving gear and we were the only dive boat on the spot, so I assumed he was with us and I just didn't pay attention to him on the boat. He was swimming fast towards me and then signed me that he was out of air. When an air failure happens in scuba diving, there is a very strict procedure. You have to help the person, no questions asked, because every second is vital. If you faint underwater, you drown. On your gear, you have 2 breathing devices, a main device and a spare device. So, I handed the guy my spare breathing device, which means that we both were breathing on my gear, consuming twice as much air as I was consuming alone. I waited till the guy seemed calmed down and tried to hand sign him to go see my instructor. He nodded a no and signed me to start our ascent. I understand this is the procedure. I was a little low on air and above the decompression stop level, so the right thing to do was going up to the surface before having an air failure, but I've had to tell my instructor first. The guy was very reluctant, and it was strange because it would have taken us like 30 seconds to tell the instructor and he would have started an ascent with us. During this time, I was panicking at seeing my own air level going down, and I saw that our instructor was staring at us quizzically and swimming towards us. It was at this moment that the guy let go of my spare air device and started swimming away, breathing again in his own breathing device. I was totally lost and started my ascent with my instructor. Once at the surface, because of the tides, I was feeling dizzy and nauseous, so my bizarre encounter wasn't the first thing that I debriefed. It was after I calmed down that I asked my instructor about what happened. "Oh, I don't know, maybe a guy who lost his group and needed some time to calm down." I replied, "Okay, but why did he told me that he was out of air?" My instructor told me that I probably misunderstood his hand signing, that he was probably not telling me he was having an air failure because he left breathing in his own device. I'm sure I saw him do the air failure sign, but okay. The next day, I joined my family during my dive, and the instructor was different. It was a girl this time, Charlie. I've had time to think about that guy and I was worried about him. So I told everything that happened to Charlie and asked her if she knew the guy and if he was okay because I didn't saw him going back to the surface. She asked me to describe him, which I did, and she told me, "Oh, that's Marvin. No, don't worry about him. He's preparing himself to become a scuba diving instructor." Every time he has a day off from the restaurant he's working in, he asked us to drive him on the coral reef in the morning and to pick him up the afternoon. I ate at his restaurant this noon and saw him. I was feeling relieved and told myself that it was just a comprehension issue with Marvin. The rest of the week went without any incident. I was doing more and more technical dives, and everything went very smoothly. Charlie was a wonderful instructor. Never saw Marvin again, that being said. Until the last dive. It was on New Year's Eve. We planned the best dive on that day. It was on a shipwreck, and I felt trained enough to try it without any instructor, just my family and I. It was Charlie's day off. It was fairly deep for a beginner like me, 30 meters at its down point, around 98 feet. My first day male instructor was there and told us that he would be exploring the shipwreck too, so we would cross him and he would help me if he saw that I needed it. It was very comforting to know, and my family felt comforted too when I told them that. So, we began our descent and started swimming around the shipwreck. We crossed our old instructor twice, but every time, I signed him that everything was okay. It was at that moment that I saw Marvin swimming towards me. At this moment, I was about 5 to 10 meters above my down point, still staying under my decompression stop level though. I was a little surprised, and even more surprised when he signed me again that he was out of air. I was mistrustful, but if there were any chance that it would be true, I couldn't not help him. So, I handed him my spare breather. This time, I've had many air left, so it wasn't a problem. He took it, started breathing in it, and took my arm. I reached to see air level instruments, but he prevented me from seeing them. Then, he signed me to start an ascent with him. I immediately signed NO. I wasn't at my deepest when he reached me, but I have been deeper during this time, and I've had a decompression stop to do. I saw that my father saw us, but he quickly looked away, probably not understanding what was going on. I tapped at my diving computer, a device which calculates when and how long to decompress, to signify it to him. He shrugged, smiled at me, and started swimming up, still holding me. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, and the thing that helped me react was that my diving computer was telling me to stop and decompress now. I then understood that I was in danger, that if I let him do what he wanted, I would dive from the bends. I then started screaming, only to remember that no noise can be heard underwater. I started wriggling frantically as I saw my father and sisters way below me, my diving computer alerting me more and more intensely. At that moment my father saw us, and he reacted. He swam very quickly towards us, and I managed to hit the guy as my dad grabbed my ankle and suddenly dragged me deeper. The guy then quickly swam away. My dad dragged me deeper again, and then we waited for a very long decompression stop to ensure that I would be okay, then started heading towards the surface very slowly and cautiously. On the surface, I started crying frantically and went back to the boat. My father then told me that he thought Marvin was my old instructor, and this was why he wasn't surprised at first. I then told it to my old instructor, who took it more seriously this time and told me to show him Marvin when he would go up to the surface. Thing is, he never did. Next day, on New Year, we went to the scuba diving club for the last time because my little sisters had a diploma to collect, and we saw Charlie. Still shocked, I told her what happened with Marvin, and then she stiffed. She told me that Marvin was at the restaurant yesterday for New Year's Eve and he didn't want scuba diving. Which means that this guy wasn't Marvin. And to this day, I still don't know who he is and what he wanted. I used to be a scuba instructor in Bali, Indonesia. Groups could book me for a casual lesson or for like a week's worth of diving where they could earn a provisional diving license. So this one group books me. They're a mixed group in their early 20s, couples and friends. Good people, silver spoons galore, but I'm not one to judge. Our first activity was underwater walking. Now, I had never tried underwater walking, since it was relatively new at the time, but I'm keen to try it. So we pile into a little boat and take the short trip out towards the mothership. Now this is just a naval term for a larger boat that smaller ones like ours can work from, but we go one step further to justify this, having spray-painted one of those huge gray alien heads onto the hull. It looked awesome, and naturally the kids loved it. Underwater walking itself was similar to the time I did snuba. Scuba plus snorkeling equals snuba in the Caribbean, and that the oxygen tanks float up on the surface of the water instead of being on the divers' backs. The other major difference to regular diving is that instead of having a scuba mask to breathe out of, we had these big old sci-fi looking helmets on. I mean, they looked like they were props from that old Lost in Space show that used to be on TV, real kitschy. I went first, and the procedure was pretty simple. I hung onto the ladder with the majority of my body in the water. They placed a small, foam rubber ring on my head to cushion the helmet, and then they finally put the helmet on. The second that it was on my body, I felt its weight forcing me to the bottom of the ocean. It was kind of scary, because I went down pretty fast, which caused the pressure to build up quickly. I made sure to swallow and yawn a bunch to negate the effects of the pressure, and I was fine. Also, I could never really get a deep breath of air because as I breathed in, the helmet began to make a vacuum and I would have to stop to let it fill in with more air. Then 2 members of the mixed group of teens followed suit before a scuba diving man came down to be our guide. He handed all of us a piece of bread in a plastic bag which drew all the fish to us. That was a lot of fun watching otherwise timid fish practically swarming us. There were metal guiding hand rails in the ocean floor, which I followed. The 2 kids followed behind me. It was very difficult to walk because the current was surprisingly strong and the helmets were quite heavy. We found it all incredibly enjoyable though. I had been diving for years, and even to me it was a novelty. As I breathed, there was a constant, loud whirring sound as the water put pressure on the oxygen tube. It was kind of annoying, but it meant that I was getting air, which was obviously good. That's why it was so scary when the sound suddenly stopped. I was confused, but it quickly came back on after about 2 or 3 seconds, and I could breathe again. It happened one more time, and again it came back on very quickly. I rationalized it by assuming that my tank had run empty and they were switching it to a different one, no big deal. I didn't understand how they would run out so quickly, but I didn't think too hard about it. It soon came back on and I could breathe, so no big deal. After about 10 minutes or so, I'm guessing, I have no idea how long we were down there, the guide points at me and indicates that he wants me to climb over the railing. I was very confused, but I did it after he made it very clear that that was what he wanted. It was kind of hard to see out any peripherals out of the masks, so it was easy to get lost. I looked back behind me to make sure that the teenagers saw where I went and didn't get lost. We made eye contact, so I assumed we were all good and then turned back around to follow the guide. He had me walking in a very small path between 2 corals, so I went very slowly to make sure that I didn't cut my legs up on them. It was hard, due to the strong underwater current, my unwieldy helmet, and an occasional tug by the air tube as I pulled it taut. As I reached the guide, my air stopped again. I figured it was no big deal, like the previous 2 times, and continued on. I followed him a bit, and it still didn't come on. 5 seconds with oxygen, then 10. I started to get confused. Was this some kind of joke? If so, it wasn't funny at all. 15 seconds. I thought to myself, don't panic. They always tell you not to panic. I panicked. I started taking quicker and quicker breaths, but I forced myself to stop that. Thanks to previous training, I knew that was the worst thing I could do. I spun around to the guide and started pounding my fist on my chest. That was the sign for I can't breathe. He seemed to notice and started walking away. I could only hope that he was taking me to the boat. I thought maybe I should just try and shrug off the helmet and swim to the surface. I didn't know if I had enough air to make it. I didn't know if the boat was above me. I didn't want to hit my head. I didn't know if I could actually shrug it off, and I didn't want to get the bends, so I figured it wouldn't be a good idea. 30 seconds. I started to notice that I was getting less and less oxygen with each breath. Water was starting to seep into my helmet. I had to look up to breathe what little air I had. I grabbed hold of the guide's arm so that I wouldn't lose him, and also so that he would understand the gravity of the situation. I gave him quite the death grip. 40 seconds without oxygen now, my lungs burned for air. I saw the ladder of the boat. I knew that all I had to do was make it there, and I would be okay. I must have gotten some sort of adrenaline rush with the renewed hope because I almost forgot about my lack of air. I fumbled for the ladder for a few seconds before I grabbed it and started pulling myself up. As I broke the surface, air came rushing into my helmet and I took a nice deep breath. Breathing had never felt better. It was definitely the scariest experience of my life, and I categorically would not recommend underwater walking.